When a police officer looks at you and says, "Show me your ID," almost every person in America reaches for their wallet. It feels mandatory. It sounds like an order. It carries the full weight of a badge and a uniform and the assumption that refusing is not something people are allowed to do. Here's what almost nobody knows. Whether you are legally required to hand over your ID during a police encounter depends entirely on a question that almost no one thinks to ask, and that almost no officer will volunteer the answer to unless you ask it directly. That question is whether you are being detained. In the United States, your obligation to identify yourself to law enforcement depends on the legal status of the encounter. If you are being detained, many states require you to provide your name or identification. If you are not being detained, if the encounter is what courts call a consensual contact, you generally have no legal obligation to identify yourself at all. You can decline. You can walk away. And the officer cannot use your refusal to identify yourself as the sole basis for detaining you. Two completely different legal situations. The exact same words, "Show me your ID," and most people hand over their wallet before they ever find out which situation they are actually in. Today, I am going to show you exactly what is happening legally when an officer asks for your ID, how to determine in real time whether you are required to comply, what the law actually says in states with stop and identify statutes versus states without them, and the exact words you say before your hand moves toward your pocket. Hit subscribe right now because this channel gives you the knowledge that protects you before you need it, not after. Share this with one person before this video ends. Someone who would hand over their ID without a second thought because they did not know they had a choice. That person is exactly who this video is for. Here's the reality that most people are never taught. There is no single federal law that requires every person in America to show ID to a police officer on demand. What exists instead is a patchwork of state laws called stop and identify statutes. Currently, approximately 24 states have some form of stop and identify law on the books. The other states do not. And even in the states that do have these laws, the obligation to identify yourself is triggered only when the officer has reasonable, articulable suspicion that you have been, are, or are about to be involved in criminal activity. This comes directly from the Supreme Court ruling in Terry v. Ohio from 1968, which established the legal standard for brief investigative stops. An officer must have specific, articulable facts that justify the stop, not a feeling, not a hunch, specific facts they can describe out loud. Without that threshold being met, even in a stop and identify state, the legal obligation to produce identification may not attach. The Supreme Court addressed this more directly in Hybel v. Nevada from 2004. The court upheld Nevada's stop and identify statute, ruling that requiring a person to state their name during a lawful Terry stop does not violate the Fourth or Fifth Amendment. But the court's ruling was explicitly tied to a lawful stop, one based on reasonable, articulable suspicion. The court did not rule that officers can demand identification from anyone, anywhere, at any time, regardless of the legal basis for the encounter. In plain English, the legal requirement to identify yourself is connected to the legal justification for the stop itself. No lawful basis for the stop, no enforceable obligation to identify in most circumstances. And you cannot know whether the basis exists unless you ask. Now here is where the trap lives. Most people experience a police encounter as a single continuous event. Officer approaches, officer speaks, you respond. The legal framework underneath that encounter, whether it is a consensual contact, a Terry stop, or a full arrest, is invisible to most people in the moment. Officers do not announce which category applies. They ask for ID in the same tone whether you are legally required to produce it or not. And because the request sounds the same in every situation, most people comply in every situation, including the situations where they had every legal right to ask a question first. Here is what the bad way looks like. Officer approaches on a street corner, in a parking lot, or after pulling you over for a minor traffic violation that has already been resolved, says, "Let me see your ID." Driver or pedestrian immediately produces identification. Officer now has your name, your address, your date of birth, your physical description, and the ability to run your information through every database available to law enforcement. You handed all of that over before you knew whether you were legally required to, before you knew whether you were being detained, before you knew whether this was a consensual encounter you had every right to walk away from. Here is what the good way looks like. Officer approaches and says, "Let me see your ID." Before your hand moves, you say this calmly and clearly. "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" That question does something nothing else in this encounter can do. It forces the officer to declare the legal status of the encounter before you take any action. And the answer to that question tells you exactly what your obligations are. If the officer says you are free to go, you now know this is a consensual encounter. You are not legally required to produce identification. You can choose to provide it or you can choose not to. Either way, you made an informed decision. If the officer says you are being detained, you now know the encounter has a legal basis, or the officer believes it does. In a stop and identify state, at this point, your obligation to provide your name or identification typically attaches. You comply. But you comply with knowledge of your legal situation, not out of reflexive deference to a question that sounded like a command. That four-word question, "Am I being detained?" is the difference between operating in the dark and operating with your rights fully visible to you in real time. Drop a comment right now and tell me, has an officer ever asked for your ID and you handed it over immediately without ever thinking to ask whether you were required to? Yes or no? I want to know how many people this happens to every single day without anyone ever questioning whether they had a choice. If you are still here, hit the like button right now, because what comes next is where this gets specific, and specific is where you stay protected. Let me break down exactly how this plays out differently depending on where you are and what kind of encounter you are in. Scenario 1. You are a pedestrian. An officer approaches you on a public street and asks to see your ID. You have not been stopped for any traffic violation. No incident has been reported. The officer simply approached and asked. In this scenario, whether you are required to produce ID depends first on whether you are being detained, which you establish by asking, and second on which state you are in. In a stop and identify state, if the officer has reasonable articulable suspicion of criminal activity and declares that you are being detained, your name is typically required. In a non-stop and identify state, even a lawful Terry stop may not require you to produce a physical ID, only potentially to state your name. In a consensual encounter in any state, you are generally not required to identify yourself at all. The encounter starts the same way in every version of this scenario. Officer says, "Let me see your ID." Your first words in every version are the same. "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" Scenario 2. You have been pulled over for a traffic violation. The officer has your license, has run your information, has resolved the purpose of the stop. The stop is effectively complete. Before handing back your documents, the officer says, "While I have you here, can I see another form of ID?" At this point, the legal purpose of the stop has been completed. You have already provided the documentation required by the vehicle code. The request for additional identification is no longer connected to the traffic stop. It is a new request. You can and should ask whether you are being detained and what the basis for the additional identification request is. If the original stop is over, your obligation to produce additional documentation beyond what traffic law requires has likely ended with it. Scenario 3. You are in a state without a stop and identify statute. An officer approaches, says, "Show me your ID." You ask whether you are being detained. The officer says yes. Even in a state without a stop and identify law, a lawful detention based on reasonable articulable suspicion may create practical pressure to cooperate. But there is no statute requiring you to produce a physical ID. You may be required to provide your name. Courts have split on this. but the requirement to hand over a government-issued identification document is less clear in non-stop and identify states. This is exactly the situation where knowing your state's specific law matters. Defense attorneys advise knowing before you are ever in this situation whether your state has a stop and identify statute, what that statute requires, name and address, or physical ID, and what the consequences of non-compliance are in your jurisdiction. Let me tell you about Terrence. Terrence is 29 years old, lives in Illinois, and was approached by an officer in a public park on a Tuesday afternoon. He was sitting on a bench. No incident had occurred. No call had been placed. The officer walked up and said, "Let me see some ID." Terrence handed it over. He always had. It never occurred to him not to. The officer ran his information. There was an outstanding administrative matter, a clerical issue with a fine that Terrence had paid, but that had not been properly recorded in the system. The encounter that started with a bench in a park ended with Terrence being detained for nearly 2 hours while the administrative error was sorted out. His attorney later asked him a simple question. "Did the officer tell you why he was asking for your ID?" Terrence said no. "Did you ask whether you were being detained?" Terrence said no. His attorney told him that Illinois is not a stop and identify state. In a consensual encounter, Terrence had no legal obligation to produce identification at all. He had handed it over because the request sounded mandatory, and he did not know he could ask a question before complying. Illinois is not a stop and identify state. The encounter was consensual. Terrence was free to go, and free to decline the ID request the entire time. He did not know that. Nobody had told him. 2 hours of his life and a legal headache that followed came directly from that gap in his knowledge. Terrence now knows what to say when an officer asks for his ID. After this video, so do you. Here is the exact process you follow every time an officer asks for identification. Before your hand moves, you say, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" Calm voice, no attitude. You are asking a legal question that the officer is required to answer. If the officer says you are free to go, you are in a consensual encounter. You can choose to provide ID or you can choose not to. You can also choose to walk away. That is your right and your decision to make with full information. If the officer says you are being detained, you ask, "What is the basis for the detention?" You have the right to know why. The officer must have reasonable, articulable suspicion. If they can state it, you know where you stand. If they cannot, every minute of that detention is legally questionable. If you are being lawfully detained and you are in a stop and identify state, provide what the statute requires, typically your name, and in some states your address, and in some states a physical ID. Comply calmly. Do not argue at the scene. Do not physically resist. If you are being lawfully detained and you are not in a stop and identify state, you may have no legal obligation to produce a physical ID. State your name if required by common law or statute in your jurisdiction. Beyond that, you can say, "Officer, I am not aware of a legal requirement to produce physical identification in this state outside of a traffic stop. I am not refusing to cooperate. I want to understand my legal obligation before I comply." Then, immediately after the encounter, document everything: the time, the location, the officer's name and badge number if visible, exactly what was said, what you were asked to produce, and what you provided. That record is your attorney's starting point if any of this ever matters later. Here is the recap of everything you now know. There is no universal federal law requiring you to show ID to a police officer on demand. Your obligation depends on whether you are being detained, what state you are in, and whether that state has a stop and identify statute. Before your hand ever moves toward your wallet, you ask, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" The answer to that question tells you exactly what your legal obligations are in that moment. In a consensual encounter in any state, you are generally not required to identify yourself. In a lawful stop in a stop and identify state, you are typically required to provide your name, and in some states a physical ID. In a lawful stop in a non-stop and identify state, The obligation is narrower and sometimes limited to providing your name. You comply with what the law actually requires, not with what the request sounded like before you knew the legal status of the encounter. Think about one person in your life right now who would hand over their ID the second an officer asked, not because they know it is required, but because the request sounded like a command and they did not know they could ask a question first. Share this video with them today, not later, right now before you close this tab. The question you just learned to ask takes 4 seconds, and it tells you everything you need to know about what happens next. Next week, I am covering what happens when an officer says they are going to call a canine unit to the scene, the legal limits on how long they can hold you while waiting for that unit to arrive, and the exact words that put those limits on the record before the dog ever gets there. Subscribe so you catch it the day it drops. Hit the like button if this changed how you will handle the next time an officer asks to see your ID. Drop a comment telling me what state you are in and whether you knew before today that stop and identify laws vary by state. I want to see how many people had no idea the rules were different depending on where they live. Know your rights, use them, stay safe.